As I mentioned earlier, when I said you don't want to start taking money out of your accounts during this time, you definitely don't want to start racking up a lot of debt, because there are ways to show that that debt is yours and not your spouse's. So you're going to want to be careful about how much debt you accumulate. You're also going to want to make sure that neither one of you is continuing to charge on the joint credit cards if you have the ability for each of you to get your own credit cards and start charging things there. You're going to want to separate out as much as possible. The other thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start trying to pay off the marital debt if you can. And you're going to want to keep track of what you and your spouse are spending it on. So you want to be careful, make sure your spouse isn't spending exorbitant amount of money on possibly a new partner that they have, or going on extravagant trips, or buying things that they didn't normally buy during the marriage. You want to make sure that you document all of this so that you can clearly delineate between what were your expenses and your charges and what were your spouse's, in case you need to argue in court that you're not responsible for certain expenses. So if your spouse goes on a 10-day trip to Hawaii and it costs $20,000 and you didn't go with them, and he's trying to charge that and claim that that's a marital debt, you could clearly argue that it was not a marital debt. So you definitely want to keep track of this stuff, especially if you have a spouse that's bitter and is starting to lash out in that way. So during this time, it is so super important to document the amount of time that you and your spouse are spending with your kids if you have children. So you're also going to want to record information about who took care of the children prior to the separation or prior to the divorce, because that can be important as well. But you definitely want to make sure you continue to go to your kids' activities. You want to keep things as normal as possible for them. Keep going to their games, go see their teachers, go to their doctor's appointments. Make sure that you're present, especially if you want custody of your kids. You're going to want to make sure that you're present for all of these things. And as I said, you're also going to want to make sure that you document who took care of the children prior to the divorce. So for instance, my current husband, when he was getting divorced, his wife tried to gaslight him during the custody interview process. So in our state, or at least in our county, you can get basically a mediator that you sit down with, and generally there's some type of a psychologist, and you pay money, but you meet with them individually and together. They also talk to the children. They talk to any partners that you have at the time. They basically come up with a recommendation for the court as to what they think custody should be. So during this process, his ex-wife tried to gaslight him and claim that she was the primary caregiver, even though prior to the separation, he had been the primary caregiver. He worked several shifts, several days he worked on a third shift, but he was home in time to get their son so that she could go to work. She had a career. She worked a lot of hours every day. She basically only was home long enough every night to maybe give him a bath and put him to bed, but she wasn't there very often. So my husband was the primary caregiver, took care of him. She even moved out of state at one point to take on another job. And so they were living in another state for about 4 or 5 months before they found a home in Pennsylvania. And during that time, he would bring their son up here to see her. He'd drive that distance with him a couple of times a week or whatever to bring him up here so that she could see him and spend time with him, because she wasn't coming home. So all of this was important because she tried to say that because she made the doctor's appointments, that she was the primary caregiver. Well, she never took him to the doctor's appointments. And that was all recorded by the doctor's offices who attended the appointments. And consistently it said, child was brought by the father, and things of that nature. So she definitely was desperate to try to keep custody, at least keep 50% custody. So she was trying to mitigate the fact that she did not spend a lot of time with him prior to filing for divorce. So things like that, you're going to want to keep track of and make sure that you've got a really strong case. And if you have an attorney, you're going to want to make sure that your attorney knows all of this. In the journal that you can get from me for free, I do include information in there. I include a custody tracker. I also include a daycare tracker, because you're going to want to make sure you record who is picking them up, dropping them off from daycare, who's primarily attending their appointments, things like that. So in this workbook, I have all kinds of checklists and things in there that you can record all of this information. And you're definitely going to want to record it, because you're not going to remember everything that happens if you end up having to testify. It could be another year before you make it to court. And a lot of things can happen during that time. So you definitely want to make sure that you keep documents of all of this stuff so that you can pull out the things that are extremely important or the things that you feel help your case, or your lawyer can pull out when it comes time to testify in court. So definitely make sure that you record this stuff. Don't just rely on your memory. So this is number 10, and I did allude to this a little bit earlier, but this is about not allowing your spouse, especially if you make less money or no money, you do not want to let them manipulate you by making a handshake deal that they will pay you a certain amount of child support every month, and they're going to pay it on the 1st or the 15th or however that works. You want this to go through the court for several reasons. Number one, the court determines what it should be. So you don't want your spouse lowballing you, and your spouse doesn't want to be paying more than they should. So it's advantageous to, if you don't go through the courts, at least go through the court calculator to make sure that you're getting the correct amount of support. But if you go through the courts, they'll determine how much your spouse owes. They will also attach their wages. In most states, I believe they do that. So what'll happen is their employer will withdraw the money from their paycheck before they ever get their paycheck. And then that money goes to the county or the state, and then they distribute that money directly to you. If there's an instance where your spouse doesn't make a payment, then it's up to that domestic relations department to go after your spouse for that money. So you don't have to go after them. You don't have to allow them to manipulate you, things of that nature. The one other thing you don't want to do is you cannot, in most states, use lack of child support payments as a means to control your spouse's access to your kids. So you definitely do not want to do that. That's considered parental alienation. So you can't stop allowing your children to see your spouse just because they're not paying child support. You need to go through the court system to get that child support, but you need to maintain the custody schedule and let them continue to see them. So that's really important. The other thing I wanted to point out was, so with regard to like your spouse manipulating the situation. So what happened with me was my ex-husband and I actually, at the time we divorced, we made similar amounts of money. So we put it in our divorce agreement that he would pay me a certain amount of money every month on, I think, the 1st or the 15th of every month. So this was in our divorce agreement. So for a while, he was paying the child support. And then when we had split custody 50-50, it got to a point where it was not 50-50. It was more like 80-20 or 90-10. I had the kids the majority of the time. And so he wasn't willing to pay any additional child support. So I went to domestic relations, and we had a child support conference. And during that conference, basically, it was determined we both made the same amount of money. But because I didn't go through the formal process of modifying the custody to show that he only had them about 10% of the time, they couldn't split it any other way but 50-50. So if I had gone to court first and modified the custody to say that I had them 90% of the time and he had them 10% of the time, then when I went to file for a modification of child support, it would have reflected that, and so I would have gotten more money. But because I didn't do that, the child support was still set at 50-50. So when we left there, they were like, neither one of you owes the other any money because you make similar amounts of money. So needless to say, I was absolutely devastated because now not only was I not getting the money that he was supposed to be paying me, and I certainly wasn't getting more, which is what I was going after because I had the children majority of the time. So what ended up happening was I did get a lawyer probably about 7 to 8 months after that, trying to have conversations with him, convincing him to give me the child support because he still owed it, and he just kept refusing. So I finally got the attorney, and it turned out that because we had it in our divorce agreement that he owed me a certain amount of money every month, and because neither one of our financial situations had changed significantly, which is what the divorce agreement said, basically said that this is what support would be unless there was a major change in situation. So either I started making a lot more money or he started making a lot less money. But basically, since there was no change in our finances, however, the amount of custody had changed, the judge ruled in my favor, and he basically had to pay me child support for 18 months that he did not pay. He had to pay me the amount that was in our divorce agreement. And then the judge also required him to pay my legal fees and also interest to me on top of that for the 18 months that he wasn't paying child support. So the only way I was protected there was because we did put it in the divorce agreement, which is not something that's normally done, but it's a good thing that I did do it. So then from that time on, it was no longer that he paid me. We went through domestic relations. It was a year or two after that that I found out he was making a significantly larger amount of money. So we went back and we had the custody modified and things of that nature. But just be aware too that your spouse is probably not going to be forthcoming about additional money that they make. Even though it says in the support documentation, everything, that you are required to notify your ex-spouse and the court if you have a significant change in your income, either significantly more or significantly less. And he never notified the court. The first time we went back to court, he was making about $150,000 more a year than he had been making prior to that, and I had no idea. Then the second time we went, he was making significantly more. At this point, he makes about 5 times the amount of money that I make, but he never notifies the court. The only thing that you can do is obviously file for a modification, because then they're going to be, your spouse is going to be required to provide their financial information. But then you run into the issue of, do they owe back support now because of the fact that they never notified the court or you that they were making more money? Well, if you want to go after back child support, you're going to have to go and see a judge. It's going to cost more money in legal fees if you're using a lawyer, things of that nature. So I did not go after the back child support. I really should have, because at this point I'm running into the situation where one of our children is 17. She's going to be going to college. And even though he makes 5 times more than I do, he's not going to contribute to her college. So if I had gone after all that back child support, I could have had that extra money, hopefully in the bank, that would have helped to pay for her college, since he's not going to be contributing. So there's a lot of things that you need to think about when it comes to support. So definitely don't try to deal with the support on your own. Get the courts involved. I hope this information was useful. Be sure to check out my next video, which is 5 mistakes made during an uncontested divorce. And please click the link below if you want to get a copy of my free digital journal.